the treatment of the Irish in Ireland by the British, which people familiar with African American history would recognize right away. You say, oh my God, this is so similar, right? I mean, it's striking. Specific examples of racial oppression that he talks on in the book, but the main ones he focuses on these two, but also American Indians in the 19th century he talks about, and we can talk later about why he focuses on that period. Essential elements of discrimination. Again, people familiar with African American history are going to know this, but he talks about how in the early period there's the destroying the original forms of social identity, right? You have African chieftains coming here being slave, right? And exclude the oppressed group from admittance into the forms of social identity normal to the colonizing power. That's two of the early characteristics. Go on, Sean. He lists 4 characteristics of racial oppression, goes into detail how they existed, you know, in 18th century Virginia. And of course, if you look at these and update them, we still all have variants of each one of the 4 today, right? The declassing legislation, deprivation of civil rights, illegalization of literacy, displacement of family rights. Go on, Sean. He considers the hallmark of racial oppression the reduction of all members of the oppressed group to one undifferentiated social status, the Dred Scott decision. Sean. He emphasizes that the ruling elite has 2 principal tasks. We should never lose sight of this. They seek to maximize profit, but they have to maintain social control, right? And, go on, Sean. So Allen offers 2 general principles of social control regarding problems of the colonizing power. And this is very instructive when we look at what happens in the U.S. versus the Caribbean versus Latin America in particular, right? But he goes, in general, these are the general, again, I want to get some thoughts out there so people can look and maybe get sparked to look further into this. After establishing commanding authority, the colonizing power pursues one of 2 general lines of policy. Sean? Where they found a developed and well-defined hierarchical system, the Aztecs, the Incas, right? There's a hierarchy. The new rulers sought to adapt the pre-existing social structure to their own needs, co-opting amenable elements and using them as a buffer and social control stratum, right? That's one approach. Sean, next one. However, where they encountered a society with no previously developed hierarchy like that, and he's talking now the Spanish in the Caribbean, and particularly this one, the English in North America, right, which is the one that go focus on. The conquerors employed a policy tending to the complete elimination of the indigenous population, which is what happens in the Caribbean, by slaughter and or expulsion, forcing them out, you know, which is what happens in Virginia, right? They keep moving the Indians out. But then, as they remove the native population, in this second situation, the colonized have to seek foreign supplies of labor to produce that profit, right? If they're not going to be able to force it on the people there, then they've got to get a labor supply, and it's got to be a labor supply that they can control. And this is getting very deeply into how the U.S., what we know as the U.S., differs from elsewhere. Go on. Here's his quote. I like this one about the slaughter and expulsion. Bourgeoisie could care less, right? Looks upon progress indifferently. Sean, next. Okay, he lays out a little schema for, in general, the social structure of class societies. He's using the phrase buffer social control stratum. It's basically the people in the middle who live in relative economic security, subordinate to the ruling class, day-to-day contact with the regular folks, people at the bottom with no productive wealth. Go on. In differences in a key distinction between national oppression and racial oppression. And he makes this distinction throughout both volumes. This is very important, I think, for people, because we use these phrases, a lot of us now. He says one of the key distinctions is the source from which the social control stratum is recruited, whether it's from the oppressed or the oppressor group. Sean, under a system of racial oppression, social control depends upon denial of the legitimacy of social distinctions. That's what we knew in 18th century Virginia, right? Under national oppression, social control depends upon the acceptance and fostering of social distinctions. You're a national bourgeoisie, if you will, right? Come on. Under racial oppression in Virginia, any person of discernible non-European ancestry after Bacon's Rebellion, after they start setting up this system, were denied a role in the social control buffer. Whereas in contrast, in the Caribbean, mulattoes were included in the social control group and were promoted to middle class status. And that's, we see in St. Croix, Jamaica, Barbados. We're talking Anglo-Caribbean now. Come on. Sean, sorry. So he says that this difference was the key to understanding the difference in the policy between Virginia's ruling class policy, because Virginia not only doesn't include any African Americans in the policy, but they fix a perpetual brand on every African American. He explains why and how this again differs from what is done elsewhere, right? One statistic, and people can think about this, in Jamaica, on the eve of emancipation, 23% of the enslaved African labor force were owned by people of color. It's a qualitative difference, right? Come on. The difference was rooted in the objective fact that in the West Indies, there were too few laboring class Europeans to embody an adequate petty bourgeoisie. And this gets to do with that demographics again. Remember St. Croix, you only got 5% European. There's no poor whites, so you can't base your social control system on them. Whereas in Virginia, for example, there were so many, and we're going to get into why and how Virginia develops and how Anglo-America, the plantation colonies, develop. So the difference is rooted, West Indies, there were too few laboring class Europeans, while in the continental colonies, there were too many to be promoted to the petty bourgeoisie. Next, middle class. All right. He also talks about the transition from racial to national oppression. He's going to try and show the relativity of race. So he talks about how the British West Indies in the British West Indies, they try and implement the same system that they try and do down in Virginia, but it doesn't work because of those demographics and because it's a small area and the plantations and small growers can't compete with the plantations. There's no room, right? So, and in both cases, in both the British West Indies and Ireland, the colonial ruling elite, faced with a combination of insurrectionary pressures, resolved this situation by the decision to recruit elements of the oppressed group. That's what we see in the Anglo-Caribbean. We're not yet sure. And that's what we see in Ireland, right? All right, so he talks about how he talks about this. So what you have is you have a situation where it's the same Anglo-bourgeoisie, the British bourgeoisie in Ireland, in the Caribbean, and in Virginia. But they develop different systems of social control based on the necessity of the situation. He's trying to undercut this argument that it's based on skin color, right? Because whereas we know, African Americans have no rights, but it's different in the Caribbean. We're not used to thinking in terms of these Irish have no rights, in Ireland, right, under the British, right? But that's the situation. So come on now. Come on. No parallel. So this is a major difference that he elaborates then: national oppression, racial oppression. This is what we talked about. Harrison, McKay, Garvey, they're all coming from this situation of national oppression, where they're not used to this virulent white supremacy that they encounter in the U.S. Sean, next slide. He starts to close Volume 1, get ready for Volume 2, by talking about how in the period after emancipation, there's a conscious ruling class decision to once again turn to a system of racial oppression. And what he talks about is key, how they set up the white privilege systems in key things, in the land policy, the immigration policy, and industrial employment. One more, Sean. So, and the last chapter of Volume 1, I think, is very instructive, particularly for people here in New York, because it talks about New York City. And it talks about the Irish. And the wave of Irish that comes in mid-19th century comes to New York and points out and describes how these Irish immigrants are victims of racial oppression in Ireland, and they come here and they become opponents of abolition, supporters of slavery, and viciously anti-white white supremacist opponents of African Americans, right? And he ties it again to the forces that are driving that. New York, people may know, during Civil War, big tie, Fernando Wood wanted to go, the mayor of New York wanted to, align with the southern states, right? And because it was financial interests, right? And he talks about the southern slaveocracy interests and the Catholic Church hierarchy, Irish American establishment, Catholic press, Tammany Hall. These are the forces really driving this this force to make these Irish white, right? White. They're victims and vicious opponents of the British, and all of a sudden things are changing here. Okay, so now we go to volume 2. This is what he called his best work. This is it. It's about 17th century Virginia. This is what he did all that research on. Virginia, founded 1607, Jamestown. Key dates, 1622. We're going to talk about this. 1670, reduction to chattel labor status. Bacon's Rebellion, revisal of Virginia laws. Sean. Okay, this is the outline of the chapters. Next one. And again, the appendices. And see, he's getting into maroon communities, the bond labor system, the ruling class decision. Now, when we did these new books, I should tell you, I'm going to encourage people to get them, they've got new introductions, they've got new additional appendices that I put in there, background on his thought and what he's doing. But what they also have, each volume has a 25-page study guide so you can get through them, because these are not easy to get through. And there's greatly expanded indexes which also get into the notes. So the purpose of doing this was so you could really get into, and look, you want to look up maroon societies, here's all the pages, things like that. All right, going on. Okay, two common challenges faced by the European colonizing powers. This is what we described a little before. They have to secure a supply of labor and establish a system of social control. That's the two key tasks, right? Once they come, they got to colonize. Here's where the English differ from all the other European colonizing powers. That's why it's different in Spain or Portugal. In both those respects, the Anglo-American plantation bourgeoisie differs from the other. Sean? Spain and Portugal had no surplus laboring population. They came as conquistadores, right? But the population density in Peru and Mexico afforded them a supply of labor. When the Caribbean peoples were exterminated, and when enslavement of Brazilians proved, not workable because they had a great continental expanse to flee to, they turned to African laborers for plantation. France tried to send some French workers for a while called engagés, but it didn't work. They were high wages, and on these islands, again, you can't compete with the big plantations, right? And come back, and it was also on the supply route. Santo Domingo, Haiti, Dominican Republic was on the supply route direct from Africa, the way the currents came and stuff. Sean, come on. Holland was had major involvement in the trade of African laborers, right? But it had no surplus labor for export. So its main role was supplying plantation labor from Africa. England is different. It had a surplus of necessitous poor, needy poor, because it had undergone an agricultural transformation, a capitalist transformation. They closed the monasteries, right? They're kicking people off the land. There's enclosures, right? People are wandering around. They're vagabonds. And I'm not exaggerating, because they pass laws. They try and enslave the vagabonds. 1547 is the attempt to enslave the vagabonds. The source of labor was cheaper than any alternative source, and it was cheaper. For the English, this was the cheapest labor source, because they had them right there and they could get them over there. Come on. Key difference of all the European colonizing powers, only England used European workers as basic plantation laborers. We're going to talk about the difference. Why is it different in the U.S. than the Caribbean and stuff? This starts pointing us in the direction. Next. So the uniqueness was not that it came in the chattel labor form. Chattel labor form is all the various forms of bondage and what we call slavery. That was throughout the Americas. Nor that there were non-Europeans involved. That was throughout the Americas. What was unique about the plantation colony, Virginia, Maryland, and Allen, let me just say, Allen focuses on Virginia because that's where it starts. That's the pattern-setting colony. But that's the founding. 7 of the first 12 presidents are out of Virginia. This is setting the tone and the pace, and it's the model that's copied later on. Okay, so Allen argues the peculiarity was not in the supply aspect of bond labor particularly, but it was in the control. Specifically, that what they wound up developing in the U.S., any person of degree of non-European ancestry was excluded, and the buffer social control stratum was made up of free proletarians and semi-proletarians. Sean, next. Regarding the English background, he does some nice little background, what you were just asking. He reviews some key developments in the history of development of capitalism in England. Sean, what is very important is in 1547 there was an attempt to enslave English in England, and there's a rebellion, and they fight and they beat it back, and they establish some common law principles. And he talks about other reasons why they didn't persist in that, because of the cost-benefit analysis, which he goes into. Allen is a very trained economist. I said he was a coal miner and stuff. He comes to New York. He teaches at the Jefferson School, which was a Communist Party school for many. He leaves the Communist Party, but he teaches economics there, Marxist economics.